Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi. Chapter 3 The Counter Revolt of Islam. The Religious Intellectual and the Intellectual of Religion. The growth of the phenomena of religious intellectuals could also be traced to the period of the interregnum. These were individuals who combined an abiding interest in Islam as an ideology for change with varying degrees of exposure to the West. They stood in contrast to those whose training had been in the more traditional roots of the seminaries and colleges of Sunni and Shia Islam. Shiism would also feature prominently in the eruption of Islam onto the public arena in the 1970s. The relationship between the religious intellectuals and the ulama would not always be smooth. The traditional ulama saw religious intellectuals mainly as interlopers, while the frequently anti-establishment tone of the latter often descended into a campaign against the role and power of the ulama. This was especially true in Shia Islam, where there was a clear hierarchy of religious authority, culminating in the higher ranks of the mujtahids and grand ayatollahs. However, at the same time, when secular governments were in control in many countries across the Muslim world, rivalries were buried in the face of a common enemy. A few of the traditionally educated ulama would embrace the generally uncomfortable intermingling of the Western thought into the categories of Islam, while an even smaller number of religiously minded intellectuals would carve out a privileged status for the traditional scholars in their vision of a revived and purified Islam. Later, when Islam would be a far more prevalent consideration in the public sphere, these latent conflicts would break out, often in a violent and even bloody denouement. Both these currents, however, developed a treatment of the issues that faced Islam in ways that were novel and appealing to the newly literate and urbanizing classes in the Muslim world. Unlike Banabi, whose theory of civilizational cycles did not look for its origin or justification in doctrinal Islam, the new order of religious intellectuals sought to connect their expositions to the doctrinal creeds of Islam and to novel readings of formative events in Islamic history that could be used to illustrate or confirm their views. The radical ulama, on the other hand, reread the corpus of Islamic doctrine in order to deduce from it principles which could be classified as modern and which could therefore increase Islam's appeal to the secularized or secularizing classes. In the world of Shia, the figures of Ali Shariati 1933 to 77 in Iran and Ayatollah Baqir al-Sadr 1935 to 80 in Iraq represent the twin poles of modern educated intellectual. Shariati blended Islam and radical Western social and political theory into a new amalgam, whereas al-Sadr was the traditionally educated seminarian trying to come to terms with ideologies of the period and diffuse their appeal within the Islamic framework. Shariati died in mysterious circumstances in London in 1977, a few months before the start of the cataclysm which would turn into the Iranian Revolution, while Ayatollah Baqir as-Sadr was murdered in 1980, a year after the triumph of the Iranian Revolution. In the world of Sunni Islam, the most potent of the religious intellectuals was Sayyid Qutb, 1906 to 66, held by many to be the inspiration behind the radicalization of political Islam and the birth of the jihadi culture. Qutb became the chief spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood after its suppression in 1954 and continued as its main pamphleteer and ideologue until his execution in 1966. Prior to the 1980s, when political Islam became divided along sectarian lines, there was a great deal of intermingling of the Shia and Sunni modernists' thought with little of the sectarian tensions that would emerge later. There was a common enemy, the centralized, secularized state, whether it was militarily dominated, an absolute monarchy, or a dithering traditional order. The writings of Qutb and Abul Ala Maududi, 1903 to 79, of India and then Pakistan, were an important inspiration for the nascent Shia Islamist movement, as were those of Baqir al-Sadr and Shariati before the division of political Islam into Shia and Sunni components. All these thinkers were attempting to come to grips with the political dimensions of the Muslims' relative powerlessness and with the deep sense of injustice that was festering behind the authoritarian surface of Muslim countries. Most of them did not really understand the dynamics of change in the Western societies, and by the time Islam supposedly caught up with one Western system, the world would have moved on to another set of concerns. A game of catching up is an enduring feature of Islam's encounter with the prevalent ethos of the Western world. There is a datedness that is clearly apparent in much of the writings of this period. Nevertheless, the views of these authors were held in high esteem by their audiences in the urban centers of the Muslim world, including young Muslims. They were on much surer grounds, though, when they dealt with the ailments of their own societies and when they drew on Islam's history and doctrines to buttress their argument. Ali Shariati, a graduate of the French university system, was deeply influenced by the writings of the anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon, together with the works of the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and his former communist professor of sociology, Georgy Gurevich. Returning to Iran in 1964, Shariati taught at various universities, but his principal platform was the Irshad Hosseiniya Meeting Hall in Tehran, where he lectured regularly to a packed audience on Islam, on modernism, and on an unorthodox interpretation of Shia doctrines. Shariati's principal method was to use the pathos inherent in the Shia traditions of martyrdom and suffering and to relate them to the striving for justice and equality found among the disadvantaged in Iran and elsewhere. He related key events, episodes, and heroes of Islam, especially Shia Islam, which resonated with the public at large, to modern ideological theories, mainly radical or utopian. Thus, his book on the Prophet's companion, Abu Dhar al-Ghafari, was to turn this ascetic and pious man into a paragon of utopian socialist action who did not flinch from speaking the truth in the face of power. He used the pattern of the life of Prophet's daughter Fatima as a way of introducing the idea that women's rights and empowerment were central concerns of true Islam. Shariati also tried to link reactionary aspects of clerical power in Iran to the idea that there were two distinct phases of Shiism and by inference of Islam as a whole. The first was true Islam associated with the model of Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and the first of the Imams of Shia, and so-called Safavid Shiism, which Shariati related to the seizure of Shia Islam by the clerical classes in alliance with the Safavid dynasty. The latter introduced Shiism forcibly as the state religion of Iran in the 16th century. Shariati narrative suggested an ideal Islam of early period and a deviant Islam associated with abusive power and control by usurpers. In some ways, this narrative followed Sunni Salafi call for a return to the ways of the early pioneers of Islam as a precondition for purifying it from its unacceptable accretions. But Shariati was far more influenced by Marxism than he let on, and this infused into his utopian Islam a clear inclination in favor of revolutionary struggle against the rich and powerful. However, Shariati encroached on dangerous territory and his writings strayed too far from conventional Shia positions. There was an unmistakable residue of distaste for the Shia religious hierarchy, which he had implicitly held responsible for the decline of the vital spirit of Islam. Several of Iran's ayatollahs issued fatwas against him, but not significantly. Ayatollah Khomeini, they accused him of un-Islamic writing and supported the authorities' action against him and the closure of the Irshad meeting hall. The hierarchy had closed ranks against an interloper, and even though Shariati was posthumously rehabilitated after the Iranian Revolution, he still remains a controversial figure in the world of reformist Shia Islam. In the final analysis, Shariati could not challenge the guardians of faith, partly because he was unskilled and without the appropriate credentials in the doctrines of Shia Islam. The other attempt at affirming the significance of Islam in a modern context came from the opposite end of the spectrum, that of the religious authority trying to refute the truth and the appeal of the ideologies of time by subjecting them to a critical analysis based on an Islamic argumentation. Such was the method of Ayatollah Baqir as-Sadr in Iraq, a precocious and original thinker whose education was undertaken entirely within the traditional seminary or hawza. The rise of communist movements in Iraq was seen as a dangerous threat to Shia masses whose recent urbanization made them a prime target for intellectual preaching the doctrines of liberation through class struggle. Al-Sadr's main focus was the educated youth whose drift towards ideologies other than Islam he sought to reverse. His works, especially his critique of communism and capitalism in Iqtisaduna, the Islamic economy, and Falsafatuna, the Islamic idea, had a profound influence on the generation who came up of age in the 1960s and 1970s. In these works, as-Sadr deconstructed Marxism and capitalism and sought to demonstrate their inability to produce a just and equitable society, which only Islam could do. His analysis of liberal capitalism and communism was based on the sources available to him, mainly an inadequate set of indifferently translated works of the Western classics of philosophy and political economy. The Hawza in Iraq simply did not have the intellectual means to examine systematically the contents of Western thought in all its variety and complexity. This shows through quite painfully in as-Sadr's work, but he did succeed, and brilliantly, in breathing new life into Islamic categories of thought and doctrine on important principles of political economy and moral philosophy. As-Sadr's treatment of property rights, economic relations, and the nature of the just society, income and wealth distribution, factors of production, and finance and interest was unique up to a point. It constituted a towering achievement in bringing Islamic thought to bear on the understanding of the modern world. But in as much as it was pioneering and fecund, when seen in an Islamic context, it was insufficient as a critique of modern thought. The relative isolation of as-Sadr from the world's centers of intellectual activity and his dependence on translations and indirect assessments show through in his work. As-Sadr was not hounded by the religious establishment, partly because of his lineage and impeccable seminary credentials. The hierarchy did look askance at his works, seeing in them a drift from the traditional concerns of grand ayatollahs. Even so, as-Sadr had enormous impact on the religiously minded youth and inspired a large number of people into religious activism and into Islamist politics. He was arrested and executed by Ba'ath authorities in 1980, a few months before the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War. The spread of Islamism. The spread of these early Islamist ideas and doctrines was facilitated by the increasing literacy, but also by their authors' skillful use of both traditional institutions and the new universities for the diffusion of their version of political Islam. Maududi's party, Jamaat-e-Islami, was frequently in conflict with the Pakistan authorities and was shut down from time to time. Maududi himself was put in jail several times, but Pakistan's censorship rules were generally lax and its political persecutions were short-lived. Maududi's ideas could circulate freely and were not proscribed as such in Pakistan. The Jamaat-e-Islami party was the main instrument for the propagation of Maududi's thought to Urdu speakers. His writings were translated into all major languages of Islam, where they became a cornerstone of modern Islamist thought. Their impact was especially significant among Arabic speakers. The situation with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was far more uncertain. Following the execution of Sayyid Qutb in 1966, a large number of Brotherhood stalwarts left Egypt for Saudi Arabia and North Africa, especially Algeria. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the policies of King Faisal were directly in favor of the pan-Islamic causes. King Faisal himself was a pious, even ascetic Muslim, but equally important factors behind Saudi Arabia's Islamic policies were the dangers from aggressive Arab nationalist doctrines and threats emanating from Nasser's Cairo. Nasser has dispatched an Egyptian military expeditionary force in support for the Republican side in the Yemen Civil War. The long-established monarchy had been overthrown by a military coup in 1962. The Saudis viewed the presence of an Egyptian army in the Arabian Peninsula as a direct threat to their stability and countered by increasing their support for Egyptian Islamist activists and for the writings of the main Sunni Islamic thinkers. The Muslim Brotherhood members who went to Saudi Arabia were specially active in the new universities and in the secondary schools, where a large number of found jobs as teachers and instructors. In its modern form, in Saudi Arabia, political Islam could be traced to the arrival there of a number of Muslim Brotherhood's senior leaders in the 1960s and 1970s. The situation in North Africa was somewhat different. The Arabization campaigns of the post-independence states of North Africa sought to rectify a dangerous imbalance caused by the Francophone educational policies of the former colonist authorities. The campaign required the import of a large number of Arabic-speaking teachers from the Eastern Arab lands. This was especially the case in Algeria, where the French had been most determined to reduce Arabic to a secondary status. Teachers were recruited into the educational system of these countries from as far as Iraq, but mainly from Egypt. A good percentage of teachers brought in from Egypt was connected to the Muslim Brotherhood in one way or another. These teachers would provide an important platform for the propagation of Islamist ideas into the North African milieu in the period of the 1960s and 1970s. In Shia world, the Hausa, the traditional scholarly circles of learned Ayatollahs, constituted the most important vehicle for the dissemination of Islamist ideas held by the politically oriented Ayatollahs. In Iraq, the advent of the Ba'ath Party to power in 1968 put an end to the open discussion of Islamist ideas in the Hausa, and political Islamists of all stripes were aggressively targeted and frequently murdered. Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Iraq for most of the 1960s and 1970s, limited his political works to theoretical, jurisprudential, and theological discussions on the nature of Islamic government. In Iran, the situation was somewhat less repressive. Although the Shah had declared war on black, that is, clerical reaction, as part of his white revolution of modernization, His secret police were more concerned with the threat emanating from the Marxist left. Politically oriented Ayatollahs such as Talekani and Motahari were allowed some leeway for expressing their views in between bouts of arrests. They were able to meet with a select group of their students or more openly in the Shia meeting halls, the Hussainiyas. The period which preceded the global upsurge in Islam was also one which saw for the first time a serious attempt to modernize the interpretation of the Quran, the so-called science of tafsir, a rereading of the foundational text of Islam in the light of contemporary conditions became essential for the Islamists, mainly in order to provide Quranic sanctions for their projects of social and political reform. These tafsir fell into a number of broad categories. The first was the reading of the Quran, which emphasized Islam's role as a catalyst of social change. This was a form of liberation theology, best exemplified by the multi-volume work of Sayyid Qutb, which was written mainly in prison and entitled Zilalul Quran, in the shade of Quran. This work was not in the line of the Salafist exegesis produced by Rashid Rida's Al-Manar newspaper in earlier parts of the century, which revolved around the harmony between Islam, science and reason. Qutb's exegesis was far more political in intent and was meant to seek Quranic sanction for fighting tyranny and to confirm Qutb's main contribution to Islamic political theory, namely the concept of the Jahili society, literally the ignorant or pagan society. This was essentially the diametrical opposite of Islamic society, one which every believer would be obliged to struggle against. Qutb extended the scope of the Jahili society beyond its historical and religious understanding of pre-Islamic Arabia to include not only Western societies but also secular Arab and other nominally Muslim states. Qutb's radical rereading of the Quranic text was profoundly significant for the burgeoning Islamic movement. It anchored its political certainties in the ineffable text of the Quran and gave it legitimacy in the eyes of the wider Muslim public, which the movement would not have enjoyed otherwise. Another category of tafsirs included the rationalist interpretations of the explanations of Quran, such as the message of Quran, possibly the most influential of the interpretations of the Quran in English. This text was written by Muhammad Asad, whose interpretation of the Quran was greatly influenced by the rationalist Mu'tazila school in classical Islam and by the great classic tafsir associated with Al-Zamakhshari. It was nevertheless an innovative attempt to convey a rationalist interpretation of the Quran in a more accessible and persuasive way to modern readers. Asad's work had royal patronage. In 1963, Prince Faisal, later King of Saudi Arabia, instructed the Saudi-linked Muslim World League to subscribe in advance to Asad's translation. However, even before its full publication in 1980, the translation and commentary fell foul of the ulamas of Saudi Arabia. In 1974, on the basis of a number of already translated sections of Quran, Asad's efforts were denounced on the grounds that they were too metaphorical and modernists. The ulama banned the book's circulation in Saudi Arabia. It was left to Saudi Arabia's oil minister Ahmad Zaki al-Yamani to come to the rescue of Asad's crowning life achievement. Yamani, a personal friend and admirer of Asad, bought nearly 25,000 copies of Asad's translation and commentary, filling the gap that was left when the Muslim World League failed to meet its commitment to purchase these copies. Asad's translation and commentary had wide appeal among English-speaking Islamic activists, especially in Europe and South Asia and Malaysia. The Re-emergence of Islam. Ideas and textual rereadings in and of themselves do not produce epoch-making changes. The potential for revolt in the world of Islam against the traumatic changes of the past century and a half might have always been there, but it took a series of powerful changes to make this revolt explicit. The dethroning of prevailing ideologies and systems required an explicit manifestation of their failure before their wholesale abandonment by the people at large. Something of this kind happened with the catastrophic defeat of the combined Arab armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan by Israel in the 1967 war. While the immediate outcome was a shrill insistence on the continuation of the struggle and a temporary upsurge in the appeal of revolutionary movements, the effect on the Muslim world was a thorough discrediting of the claims of nationalism and socialism as organizing principles of Muslim states and societies. The systems which prevailed in the defeated Arab states professed the very same nationalism and socialism that had been seen earlier as the gateway to modernizing and re-empowering the Arab. Islam loomed as the only credible alternative. In one state after another, the 1970s saw the demise of radical socialist or nationalist governments. Egypt's Anwar Sadat drew on Islamic political movements as part of his campaign to eliminate the remnants of Nasserism. The populist Bhutto was hanged in Pakistan by a military dictator bent on Islamicizing the country, while Turkey's descent into near civil war in the 1970s between extreme left and right drove the army, the bastion of the secular establishment, to open the way for a guarded re-entry of Islam into the political sphere. However, what shifted the balance in the Muslim world towards an open association of the modern state with Islam was the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which installed an avidly Islamic Republic as the model of government. A rapidly expanding population, urbanization, increased literacy, growing income disparities between and within Muslim states, and an exploding oil price all played their part in setting the stage for the re-emergence of Islam onto the public arena. But it was a fundamentally different Islam from the one which had virtually disappeared in the post Second World War era. The failure of transplanted Western institutions and ideologies to set abiding roots in the Muslim world was clear, but the effects of decades of rapid fire change could not be easily dispelled. For a brief moment after the success of the Iranian Revolution, a possible future beaconed, built around the experiences, nascent institutions, and ideology of the revolution. In its early days, the Iranian Revolution transcended its exclusive association with Shiism. Not only Islamic activists of all stripes, but revolutionaries such as the PLO leader Yasser Arafat flocked to Tehran. Octogenarian Ayatollah Khomeini became an iconic figure with his ubiquitous visage replacing the radical heroes of bygone years. But the coalition that drove the Shah out of the country fell apart as the Shia religious hierarchy asserted its control under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. While in exile in Iraq, the Ayatollah had extended the principles for the rule of the jurisprudent in an Islamic government, which was a radical departure from Shia ideology and Muslim political thought. The Iranians voted for a constitution that gave supreme power to the jurisprudent Ayatollah Khomeini, and they created new institutions which solidified the power of the religious hierarchy over the state. The Council of Guardians, the Council of Legal Mediation, the status of Rehbar or Supreme Religious Authority were all drastic innovations in statecraft. There was no precedent for them, but for a while they appeared to be the structures of the type of government that Muslims were thought to yearn for. However, Islam was not to be defined by the rulings of Mujtahid Shia senior cleric, irrespective of his power and authority in his own land. The Iranian Revolution, which sought to represent itself as an Islamic and not a purely Shia revolution, was quickly typecast as, in fact, just that. After all, it derived its ultimate authority not from God but from the hidden 12th Imam of the Shia through his authorized agents, the Shia circle of learned mujtahids. The Shia hierarchy, which had maintained some of its vigor, although it was declining during the last years of the Pahlavi dynasty, had no counterpart in Sunni Islam. The Al Azhar University of Cairo, the classical source of authority of Sunni Islam, had been emasculated by Nasir and could in no way provide the ideological or theological counterweight to the nascent world of revolutionary Shia Islam. It was left to the Saudi clerical establishment, built on the bedrock of Wahhabi thinking, to galvanize the Sunni world by way of a contribution to the revolt of Islam. The opportunity afforded itself shortly after the Iranian Revolution. The Islamic centenary fell in November 1979, which coincided with the beginning of the 14th century in Islamic calendar. On 20th November 1979, a large group of religious zealots, fired by a deep hatred for Saudi royal family and for the evils perceived to beset Saudi society, seized control over Islam's most sacred site, the sanctuary and the mosque of Kaaba in Mecca. They proclaimed the imminent coming of Mahdi, the Redeemer, and they confronted the Saudi state with its gravest internal crisis for several decades. After several days of intense fighting, the rebels were overwhelmed and a large number of them executed. Most of the leaders of the rebellion had studied or had been trained under the aegis of the senior Wahhabi cleric Bin Baz. The Saudi authorities had to obtain a fatwa from Bin Baz before they could enter the mosque to confront the rebels. The formal recognition by the Saudi royal family of its dependence on the Wahhabi ulama class to fend off challenges to its legitimacy altered the balance of power inside Saudi Arabia in a fundamental sense. In quid pro quo for their support in ending the siege of the sacred mosque, the Wahhabi clerics were now empowered with near total control of Saudi educational and social policy and were provided with the means to carry the Wahhabist message worldwide. The royal family had to promise the clerics that it would reverse the slow modernization that had been occurring in the kingdom up until then. The royals fulfilled their promise. In weeks after the siege ended, female newscasters were taken off television. The enforcement of the ban on alcohol became much more severe. Within a matter of few years, fueled by hundreds of millions of dollars that Saudi treasury was giving them, the Wahhabi version of Islam began to spread wherever Saudi money could reach. In a very short period of time, a marginal splinter group in Sunni Islam became its defining theology. The virulent hatred of Shia, which Wahhabi Islam harbored, could now be used to put a stop to the conceit that the Iranian Revolution was pan-Islamic and not irredeemably sectarian in character. At another level, the spread of Wahhabi and Neo-Salafi thought became the main ideological drive behind the Afghan war of resistance against the Soviet occupation. Jihad could now be safely undertaken well away from Saudi Arabia, proving Wahhabism commitment to one of the main pillars of Islam without threatening the stability and security of the Saudi royal family. The Saudis were all too happy to redirect the zeal of Juhaymans, the leaders of the rebels, sympathizers, towards a new enemy, the godless Russians. There were signs of a resurgent Islam everywhere else in the Islamic world. In the 1980s, Algeria, the bastion of revolutionary socialism, was swept with riots which set the stage for the emergence of the mass Islamist political party, the FIS, Islamic Salvation Front. This party nearly achieved power when about to win the elections of 1992, but the army cancelled the elections, an event that sparked a decade-long civil war in which over 150,000 people lost their lives. Egypt was racked with an Islamist insurrection in the 1990s. The perennial problem of the Egyptian state, how to contain the power of the Muslim Brotherhood, became more acute as the Brotherhood was clearly the most popular political movement. Problem also migrated to Jordan, where the authorities had to manipulate the electoral results in order to deny power to the Brotherhood's offshoot. The newly independent Muslim states of the former Soviet Union were also confronted with the rise of Islam after decades of near extinction. Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan all had to contend with societies which were more avidly Islamic in customs and norms. Most of the 20th century now appears to have been a period during which Islam awaited the right set of conditions for its resurgence, but that resurgence did not bring forth the reality of a new order. Islam burst out of its confinement as an elemental, even inchoate force, flying in every direction and trying to seek its balance. Nationalism and socialism may have been forced into retreat, but the modern world was not relinquishing its hold over large parts of the elites of Muslim society. Neither was political Islam speaking in one voice. It had split into opposing Shia and Sunni camps, and these were feeding the fires of sectarianism in a far more virulent form than had ever been experienced before. At the same time, Islam's reappearance as a guiding principle in state and society obliged Muslims to confront a whole multitude of fundamental issues which were covered up when the reins of power were in the hands of others. Civilization had to be recast in a landscape where the preceding century and a half had created new realities in self, society, and the state. The footprints of modernity and the bungled attempts to come to terms with it were everywhere in Islamic society. The ethics and the values of Muslims were undoubtedly affected by secularism and the consumer culture. The institutions of state and government were recast in forms which the rest of the world could understand and relate to. The economies and markets of Muslim countries were drawn into the global system of trade, investment, and finance. The educational institutions were all based on Western pedagogical models. The nuclear family and the modern workplace affected traditional ideas of gender and family. New problems of urban chaos, overpopulation, and environmental degradation were added to the unremitting poverty and backwardness in which most Muslims lived. The third age of Islam's faithful encounter with modernity had begun.